Hello everyone. I'm very happy to see you all back on my channel. In the previous episode, the sudden storm passed as quickly as it came, but what it left behind did not simply fade away. It was not just a few broken branches, not just traces of wind and rain, but a vast emptiness, an invisible pressure, slowly weighing down on Hai's shoulders. That morning, the atmosphere in the wood workshop was no longer as noisy as usual. No sound of saw machines. No voices of people moving around. Only a lingering silence, heavy enough to make anyone feel its weight. Hai stood there, in a space once familiar, yet now strangely distant. His eyes slowly scanned around. Every small corner, every position that once had been neat and orderly, now messy, disorganized. The metal roofs, torn away, no longer in place, exposing large gaps, like wounds that could not be hidden. The storage areas, where goods once were kept, now collapsed, tilting, no longer holding their original shape. On the ground, wooden planks scattered, without any order, soaked, heavy with rainwater. Some of them, at just a glance, it was clear they were no longer intact, warped, deformed, losing their original value. Hai said nothing. He simply stepped forward, bent down, picked up a plank. His movement was slow, as if trying to hold on to something slipping away. He looked at it for a long time, his gaze unmoving, not just looking, but thinking, calculating, weighing options. Then finally, he gently placed it down. No sigh, no complaint. Yet in that silence, there was so much contained. No one needed to explain. No one needed to say more. Just by looking, it was enough to understand. This loss was not small. Not something that could be resolved overnight. But what worried him did not stop at what could be seen. Not just the damaged planks, not just the roofs needing repair, but what was waiting ahead. Those shipments were no longer just goods, but responsibility. Orders had been placed, trust had been given, agreements had been made, and most importantly, deadlines had been set. Every timeline, every commitment had been confirmed. Now, when everything no longer followed the plan, failing to deliver on time was not just a delay. It came with consequences. Not just financial loss, but compensation. Not just numbers, but reputation. And once reputation is affected, what follows becomes far harder to control. The phone in his pocket started to vibrate. At first, just one call, then another, and then one after another. That familiar sound now felt relentless. No longer routine work calls, no longer calm conversations, but pressure. Questions came continuously, without pause. When will the delivery be ready? How far have you handled it? We need a clear answer. We cannot wait any longer. Each question felt like a new weight. Hai answered the calls, one by one. His voice remained calm, still trying to explain, still trying to reassure. But only he understood. Inside himself, he was not as steady as he appeared. The answers were spoken, but lacked certainty. Not because he didn't want to, but because he did not have clear answers yet. Everything was going beyond his initial expectations. And when each call ended, the pressure did not lessen. Instead, it only grew heavier. The space around him remained silent as before. But inside him, it was completely different. Thoughts overlapping, worries piling up. With no pause, he stood there, in the middle of the workshop, between what had happened and what was yet to come. On one side, the aftermath of the storm, clearly visible. On the other, the responsibilities waiting for him to face. The distance between those two was not far at all. And he understood. He did not have much time to hesitate. The pressure did not come from one side, but from everywhere. Relentless, continuous, unstoppable. It didn't stop there. What Hai had just faced was only the visible part. The part that could be measured by sight. By the current state in front of him. Behind it were the numbers, the obligations, the things that could not be delayed. The payment for the wood he had imported earlier was still there, not yet fully settled. It was not a small amount. Not something that could be postponed indefinitely. Each passing day was not just time, but rising pressure. If he couldn't manage it in time, if he couldn't find a solution, then everything would not stop at the initial damage. Not just a loss of reputation, not just broken promises, but the risk of losing everything he had built. Bit by bit, step by step, it could all collapse. Inside the workshop, the already quiet atmosphere became even heavier. No one spoke loudly. There was no chaos. But that very silence made everything clearer. A few workers paused. Their eyes were no longer the same. No longer focused on work, but filled with concern. They looked at each other, without saying much, yet understanding the situation. Someone let out a quiet sigh. A small sound, but echoing clearly in the stillness. Others whispered incomplete sentences, yet enough to spread unease. This time, it's tough. Not sure if we can hold on. Those words were not blame, not judgment, but simply truth, spoken unconsciously. Hai heard them clearly. Every word, nothing missed. He stood there, without turning around, without reacting. Not because he didn't care, but because he understood. They were not wrong. What they were thinking was exactly what he was facing. It was just that. He could not say it out loud. Could not let his own worries spread further. He kept silent, as a way to hold on to the last bit of stability. That evening, when everyone had left, when the workshop returned to its familiar quiet, Hai stayed behind, alone. No one beside him. No one to share with. Only him. And what remained? The lights in the workshop, cast down on empty spaces, reflecting off scattered planks, creating a scene both familiar and unfamiliar. He sat down, surrounded by numbers. Numbers that were no longer just data, but pressure, debts, costs, payments due. All appeared before him. Nothing missing. He took out paper, wrote, calculated. Each equation was set. But then stopped. Not because he didn't know how, but because every result led to the same place. No clear answer. Not because he had nothing to say, but because there was too much. And he didn't know where to begin. Every time he spoke with Tieu San, his voice remained normal. No urgency. No tension. No sign of instability. "I'm fine," he would say. Like a reflex. "It's just a little damage." A light sentence. As if everything were only temporary. But the more he tried to act normal, the heavier he felt inside. Every word he spoke was no longer as natural as before. Every conversation required thought, careful consideration, choosing each word. The exhaustion didn't come from work, but from hiding. His eyes gradually changed. No longer the same ease. No longer the familiar steadiness. But a hint of weariness. A trace of distraction. Even though he tried to hide it, he couldn't hide it all. Tieu San didn't ask much. Didn't press him. Didn't force him to speak. But that didn't mean she didn't know. On the contrary, that silence was how she observed. She could feel something was changing. Not clearly, not specifically, but enough to catch her attention. A small distance was beginning to appear. Not a physical distance, but one in thoughts. She didn't say it, but that didn't mean she wasn't worried. Until one day, a moment that seemed completely ordinary became the beginning of change. While Tieu San was cleaning the house, the space was quiet, filled only with small everyday sounds. Hai's phone suddenly rang. Once, then twice, then continuously. The sound, not urgent, but persistent, enough to draw attention. At first, she didn't intend to answer. It was a habit and respect. But the calls didn't stop. They continued, as if the person on the other end refused to give up. That persistence made her hesitate. Just a few seconds, but enough for her to think. In the end, she picked up, not out of curiosity, but because of a feeling that something wasn't right. A voice came through. Immediately. No greeting. No hesitation. No softness. "When will you pay?" The tone was firm, leaving no room for delay. "If you don't pay, don't blame us." A short sentence, but heavy with meaning. No need for further explanation. It was clear enough. Tieu San stood still. No immediate reaction. No reply. No questions. Just silence. In that moment, she didn't need to hear more. To understand. To understand that what she had felt before was not wrong. To understand that there was something bigger than what Hai had said. She gently hung up. Placed the phone down. No loud sound. But inside, something had shifted. A truth had just been confirmed. That evening, when Hai returned, everything seemed normal. No rush. No visible tension. But the atmosphere was different. Tieu San looked at him for a long time. Not a quick glance. Not a passing look. But observation. And waiting. Then she gently asked. Her voice soft. Without pressure. Yet clear. "You're having a hard time, aren't you?" A simple question. Short. Not complicated. But straight to the point. Hai paused. Just for a second. But enough to notice. "No. I'm fine," he answered as before. The same familiar words. The same way of keeping things to himself. But this time, it was different. Tieu San didn't stay silent. Didn't ignore it. Didn't accept that answer. She placed the phone in front of him. No words. Just one action. But enough to say everything. I heard it. 3 words. Not loud. But enough to freeze the air. No more space to avoid. No more reason to hide. Hai looked at the phone. Then at her. He understood. There was no other way. No reason to stay silent anymore. He sighed. A long breath. As if releasing part of the pressure. Then he began to speak. Slowly. Without rushing. One thing at a time. The damage. Not just numbers. But what he had witnessed. The debts. Not just obligations. But pressure closing in. The calls. Not just reminders. But demands. And even the thought. He had once considered. Selling the workshop. A thought. He never wanted to say aloud. But now. Could no longer be hidden. When he finished. He lowered his head. Not meeting her eyes. I didn't want you to worry. That sentence. Was not an excuse. But the truth. He wanted to keep for her. A sense of peace. But that. Was what created distance. Tieu San didn't blame him. Not for hiding. Not for carrying it alone. She didn't cry. Didn't show overwhelming emotion. She simply said. Very softly. Do you think I'm here only when things are okay? That question. Was not blame. But a statement. Hai looked up. For the first time. He met her eyes. Her gaze. Held no anger. No clear disappointment. Only a quiet sadness. But with firmness. If we have to lose. She spoke slowly. Clearly. Then we lose together. Not comfort. But a choice. If we have to start over. Then we start over together. Not empty hope. But a decision. I don't need anything big. I just need you not to carry everything alone. That final sentence. Was not long. But it mattered the most. In that moment. Hai had nothing to say. Not because there were no words. But because none were needed. He only felt. Something inside him. Begin to change. The pressure from before. Was still there. The difficulties. Had not disappeared. But the feeling. Was no longer the same. No longer alone. No longer carrying everything himself. As if a part of it. Had been shared. Lighter. Clearer. He was no longer alone. In the days that followed. Nothing suddenly became easy. There was no miracle. No sudden change. But the way they faced it. Was different. They began to sit down together. No avoidance. No hiding. Every expense. Was reviewed. What could be reduced. Was reduced. What could still be used. Was used. Every decision. Was no longer Hai's alone. But theirs. It wasn't easy. There were moments of dead ends. Moments of long silence. But at least. That silence. Was no longer distance. But companionship. They were no longer alone. And then. Amid days filled with pressure. Something small. Appeared. Not loud. Not big. But enough to make a difference. An old client. Reached out. Not to push. Not to pressure. But to check in. They knew the situation. No need for much explanation. And what they said. A segment of a longer journey. Will hoai overcome this difficult time? Will the current pressures gradually be resolved? The debts. How will they be handled? The choices ahead. Where will they lead him? And will there be more challenges waiting ahead? All of it remains questions. Without clear answers. Without a defined ending. There is only one certainty. This journey is still continuing. Stay tuned for the next episode. To follow along, don't forget to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and leave your thoughts below. Your support is the motivation for these stories to keep being told. See you all in the next episodes.
Xin chào mọi người đã quay trở lại với kênh của mình. Nay thì mình đưa đến video của Hải và Tiểu San nha mọi người. Bây giờ thì mình vẫn đang trong quá trình làm video. Thì bây giờ mình sẽ chọn cho video này một ảnh phông thật là đẹp. Không biết là mọi người có theo dõi các tập trước đó không. Nếu như mà chồng ơi cho nhỏ đấy tí. Cảm ơn mọi người rất nhiều vì đã theo dõi video của mình nhé. Bây giờ thì mình đang làm và cũng sắp hoàn thành rồi. Hẹn gặp lại mọi người trong những video tiếp theo.